Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm super excited to be joined today by a guest that almost all of you will know to some degree, because I refer to Edward Hunter Christie on a daily basis because of his ruminations on both Blue Sky and Twitter. Well, I'm trying to move much more to Blue Sky these days for all the reasons I'm sure you're aware. But I'm really happy to be joined by Edward today. He is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, served as a NATO official from 2014 to 2020, holding successive roles relating to defense economics, strategic foresight, and technology policy, all of which is thoroughly relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, which is, well, it was originally going to be a discussion over the war in general, the geopolitics involved in the United States and the EU and Europe and China and Ukraine and Russia, and then all of the news from Jeddah yesterday talking about the potential for a truce. So we'll probably skew towards talking about that first and then move to those larger topics as we go. But Edward, would you like, first of all, thank you very much. Second of all, would you like to give a better introduction than I've given on who you are, what your expertise is, and how you're involved in this war in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, Jonathan, really delighted to be here. Thanks very much for the very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you, and hopefully your listeners will find this interesting. Your intro was fine. I mean, the only thing to know about me really is that I'm a commentator on foreign and security policy. I'm a think tanker, but I'm also a former practitioner in the sense that I worked inside NATO, which, when you actually work there, is somewhat less mysterious than some people might think. And I would only add, but this belongs to the atmospherics of the conversation we're going to have now, is that as someone who started off being an absolutely convinced and passionate Atlanticist, obviously I'm watching with grave concern, if not outright horror, the new orientation of the US and how the US is approaching the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think for Europeans in general, these are ominous and difficult times.
Yeah, and that's essentially where we're going to get to, because that's such a fascinating scenario. On the one hand, you're thinking this is a massive game of chess, and then on the other hand, you're thinking it's a pigeon on the chessboard throwing all the pieces all over the shop. And I'm not quite sure, how much thought is going into a lot of international diplomacy from the Trump administration. But we'll get there. First of all, we obviously had some incredibly important news coming out from Jeddah yesterday, and this is interesting in itself, where you had the US and the Ukrainians meeting in a bilateral conversation to talk about the war in Ukraine. It's nice that the Americans thought to invite the Ukrainians this time. And we heard that there is a truce that's been agreed on in principle by the Ukrainians. Interesting as well from a UK point of view is that Jonathan Powell, who is a UK political entity who was apparently quite involved in what went on yesterday as well. So that's fascinating. But what are your initial thoughts on what took place last night? How do you understand it? What do you think it has happened and is likely to happen with all of those involved?
I think the first thing to say is that as outsiders, and I'm also an outsider just like your listeners, I mean, the only insiders are the people who took part directly in the talks and the people they report to. So really the leaders of the key countries involved, they're the only ones who have the full picture. Bear in mind, the two delegations spoke for several hours, I think something like 7 hours, or I can't remember the exact number, but they talked for a very long time. And if you look at the readout, I mean, it would take you 2 minutes to read it. So a lot happened in those 7 hours. A lot happened before those 7 hours. A lot happened between Trump and Putin by phone. We don't know the total number of phone calls Trump and Putin have had, but by Trump's own admission recently, several. And obviously, I mean, governments are talking a lot. And so just for the analysis to begin with, those who've been following this war closely, you might have seen, especially if you're not in government, that actually we could know a lot of what was going on just by using open sources when the actual war was starting, when there was actual fighting, because fighting is material, it's mechanical, it's out there, and there's so many people who can gather information, film what's going on. You have witness statements all over the place. So it was relatively easy for a layperson to know quite a lot of what was truly happening. But we're now entering a phase which is a lot more closed. And this is terrible for anyone who's a friend of Ukraine and who doesn't have the tools in their hands to really help, apart from traditional support measures, whether it's fundraisers or going there. The fact is that there's a lot going on behind the scenes we simply don't know, and I don't know either. But let's focus on the few things that we do know. In the run-up to the talks, I think every listener knows this, the Americans basically cut support to Ukraine in multiple ways. It started with civilian support while the US was shutting down USAID, and very specifically, they shut down USAID assistance to repair Ukraine's electricity grid. That's a very, very critical point because it's a major target of Russian strategic bombing against Ukraine. So that's one thing they did. On the diplomatic front, they started to align what they were saying with the Russians. There was an embarrassing, frankly shameful episode at the United Nations where the Americans tried to pressure the Ukrainians into withdrawing their own resolution for the 3rd anniversary of the war. And the Americans ended up voting against that resolution. So that was a resolution at the General Assembly that said openly that Russia is the aggressor. And instead, so then, I mean, the US was voting together with Russia, Belarus, Nicaragua, places like that. I mean, even Iran abstained. So that shows the gravity of what's going on. I mean, from a moral perspective, it's despicable. Let's make no bones about it. But then, of course, there was the blow up in the Oval Office, which I consider with very high certainty was pretty much an ambush, or at least an attempted ambush, and then it actually became an ambush. So it was a successful attempted ambush.
And of course, you got the G7 as well thrown in there, where they're still doing that at the moment, trying to change the language in the G7 statement on Russia away from being, using the term sanctions, aggressor, etc., etc. So rather similar to the UN. Just throw that one in there.
Sure. I mean, basically, the U.S. diplomatic line has flipped, and typically, by the way, this is not unique to them. Typically, when a country flips its position, then it starts to consistently put the same message, the same new lines through every channel it has. So whether it's UN or any other international organization or grouping, we're going to see it systematically. So anyway, the U.S. is basically, what the U.S. is basically saying now is Russia's not to blame for the war, which is pretty enormous. And then you could ask yourself, well, why would you do that? And obviously, well, you've talked with the Russians, and the Russians would like to be, whatever happens next, off the hook for reparation payments, for example. Well, how can we be off the hook for reparation payments? Well, get the world superpower to stop saying that we're guilty, to stop saying that we committed aggression. So it's easy to imagine how much coordination there may already have been and how many upfront concessions Trump made to Putin. It's very visible. And when it's visible like that, one should also assume that those are deliberate signals sent from Washington to Moscow over the public airwaves. So it's sort of a proof. It's Americans saying, see, we promised to you that we would vote with you at the UN, and we really did it. So you can trust us now. So it's basically rebuilding trust along the lines of a reconciliation, a reconciled, or even a new US-Russia relationship, which is going to be completely different from what we had in the past. So that in itself is strategically ominous. Anyway, all this background to say that the US arms twisted Ukraine ahead of the talks, suspended arms shipments, suspended civilian aid first, then suspends arms shipments that were already approved from previous US decisions, then cuts off intelligence sharing and data services. And there's lastly a rumor I haven't been able to check, but I have seen some Ukrainians say that fighting in the Kursk region inside Russia became more difficult recently, and that they had the impression that the Russians knew exactly where they were. So I can't confirm either way whether the US somehow gave directly or indirectly intelligence to the Russians, but we can't entirely rule it out. Certainly and it's sad that we are where we
Even
are
thinking
with
about
this,
it.
that people are thinking about and thinking it may well be true. But in any case, those things we know for sure is that the US arm twists Ukraine into doing two things: signing up a minerals deal, and the US is the only Western country that is demanding a minerals deal. Europeans or other Western countries are not doing that. And it cuts off the aid. And then it says, okay, now you have to commit unilaterally to a ceasefire, even before we know whether the Russians will agree in principle, let alone in practice, to having a ceasefire. And if that were not enough, remember always, this entire war is happening, except for the small piece of Kursk Oblast, this entire war is happening on Ukrainian territory, with the Russians occupying something like 20% of Ukraine's territory, with all the death and destruction that implies, not just at the front line, but behind the front line. I think we should all remember land being occupied by the Russians. That's not just real estate or what is in the soil or subsoil, minerals or what have you. Forget about that. They're not even that important. Think of the human dimension. Think of the Ukrainian citizens who live in places like Mariupol and other places that have been occupied, where we know for a fact that there are torture chambers and all of that. So the overall picture is still very much one where whatever enthusiastic or upbeat statements you may see from anyone at this point, don't be fooled by this label of peace. The fact is that if this ceasefire agreement goes forward from both sides, which may or may not happen, we don't know, the net result will still be that Russia will have successfully occupied a large chunk of Ukraine, will have committed massive crimes, and the Russians will not be punished for this. On the contrary, the Russians are going to be rewarded, because another aspect of the new US policy, and that's in the readout from the first Saudi Arabia meeting, the one that was in Riyadh between the Americans and the Russians. The readout from the US State Department is very clear. They talk about geopolitical opportunities and economic opportunities. The Trump administration wants to do business with Russia. And that's a terrible turnaround.
I find it despicable, because it is exactly as you intimate there, that this is it's an explicit advocacy for invading other people's countries, and bully boy tactics, that you can invade. We will give you some short-term raps on the knuckles, but then we'll try and embrace you. I'm talking on behalf of the United States here. Then we'll try and embrace you, get you back into being our friends, and you probably get to keep what you have stolen. It seems unconscionable, really. But I'm wondering whether you think, because some people are saying Zelensky's played a blinder here, because you mentioned the minerals deal, but actually that hasn't been signed yet, which could be a good move. So getting to do the peace deal and the truce, and then sidelining the minerals deal, so that the peace isn't contingent upon the minerals deal. So that could be a good move from Zelensky. But also, I'm wondering what you think about who this benefits. Like a 30-day truce, assuming that it's kept to, and of course, we've got good form to suggest that Russia won't keep to it, but assuming they keep to it, who does this benefit? Neither, both, one or the other? And has Zelensky played a good move here in signing this, or was he still forced to do this?
For me, it's clear Zelensky is forced. Ukraine as a whole is forced. The amount of pressure from the United States is absolutely massive. And just look at it from the perspective of defending Ukraine. Ukraine is in a difficult position militarily, even without all of this. I mean, they fought incredibly well. And essentially what we could say is the base analysis is, this is a war of attrition where Russia has a small but nonetheless net positive advantage over Ukraine, which is why we see the front line receding, or coming forward, coming closer to moving further west, if you will. And it is a struggle. And Russia has a lot of domestic problems and vulnerabilities, but those may be further down the road. For Ukraine, the situation is more difficult. All it would have taken to turn this around, I would argue, would have been a policy of maximum assistance from Europe and America together. And I still believe that had that happened, and were it to happen now for that matter, the war could still turn completely the other way and Ukraine could ultimately be victorious. And I believe that Trump knows this. So I think what America is deliberately doing is, first of all, that there's a choice being made, that Russia is not going to lose this. America cannot allow Russia to lose. So that's, first of all, the first orientation. Everything about saving lives, of course, that's nonsense. I don't think Trump cares about other people's lives.
Agreed.
And so what we're looking at here basically is, I think Trump cannot openly simply allow Russia to steamroll over the whole of Ukraine unless he has an excellent excuse for doing so. And I believe that what he's been doing was potentially looking for pretexts or excuses for doing exactly that. But on the other hand, he's constrained. He's constrained, I think, by America's image, by what allies say to America, although he doesn't listen much, but nonetheless, he cannot go 100% pro-Russian. He has to be somewhere on an intermediate trajectory. But I think his vicious calculation, and I think he's someone who's much more calculating than people give him credit for. I think his calculation is basically to give Russia a genuine de facto practical win in this war, meaning Russia gets to keep territories it successfully conquered, and Russia ends up north of this with a better economy than it currently has. So if you look at it from a material perspective, from an objective, sort of more Western-minded perspective, Trump is basically trying to give Russia the win. And so the only doubt here is whether the Russians will be intelligent enough to take the win that they're being given, or whether they're so hell-bent on their traditional sort of Chekist Russian imperialist way of thinking that they just prefer to continue to try to destroy Ukraine completely, in which case the story is going to get more complicated. But frankly, if Putin were able to take a pause from his usual self and think like a rational Western leader, he would take the ceasefire immediately. He would keep the territories. He would never pay reparations. I think all of that is within reach of Moscow.
Yeah, I have a tendency to join a few more dots at the moment. I was looking at, I'm going to bring it up actually at the moment. I was looking at this last night because you take into account what's going on in Ukraine with Russia and the US's approach to Russia and trying to almost, it appears that, to me at least, that Trump, like you say, he certainly doesn't care about the outcome for Ukraine. He's got no care about whether he does the right moral thing for Ukraine, or even does the right long-term political thing for Ukraine in terms of international strategizing. I don't think he thinks like that. I think he's purely transactional and thinks very much short-termist and thinks in very tangible, what deal can I get out of this type thing. So when he's looking at Russia, he's seeing them in those sort of terms. And then you start joining this to the trade war on Canada. And you can argue the EU and Mexico, but with Canada, it's interesting because potash is an important import from Canada, involved in fertilizers, and it's fascinating that he wants to relieve sanctions on Belarus, particularly for potash. So there's a joining up of that, and then he's doubled the tariffs yesterday on aluminium and steel. And then I was reading this from one source. Saying, just to connect the dots here, Oleg Deripaska. So Oleg Deripaska is this very controversial oligarch who's connected with Paul Manafort and the Trump 1.0 tenure. He owns Rusal, is currently sanctioned. So it's sanctioned at the moment, but it's the world's second largest producer of aluminium and would be well placed to replace Canadian aluminium if US sanctions on Rusal are lifted, as they were in Trump's first term. And then also of note, Mr. Deripaska, 51, has been a recurring figure in the investigation that has ties to Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, who pleaded guilty in September 2018 to attempted witness tampering and conspiring against the US. So you start joining some of these dots and you're thinking there is a lot of motivation for the US to get into bed with Russia here, economically speaking. Is that a fair analysis?
I would. So I think it's great that you pointed out those examples, but I would flip the perspective around. It's not so much that there's a lot of U.S. interest in doing that. I don't think there is a genuine U.S. national interest in any of that. Quite frankly, I think Trump is acting against the U.S. national interest as traditionally understood, as if you consider the U.S. to be a Western democracy. What I think is actually happening is there's a fundamental decision by Trump and by the people around him to do a massive historical and strategic reconciliation with Russia, and that comes first. And then the rest fits under that. So what deals could one make with Russia? Well, that depends on what Russia can supply. And then that's going to impact how Trump does trade wars with allies. So
Right.
I would say it's the other way around. And I think what they think is, and I really recommend all viewers to look at the Breitbart News interview of Marco Rubio from about 1 or 2 weeks ago, I think, where essentially what he describes, it's not quite a reverse Nixon. A lot of people talk about reverse Nixon. Don't be fooled by that label. But it looks a little bit like it. And what it is in reality is the United States rescuing Russia at a strategic and economic level from the cost of Russia's own errors and aggression, from the consequences of its aggression. That's what's really going on. So America wants to prop Russia back up again. I think that's fundamentally what they want to do. And Rubio says so pretty clearly. I mean, he says in that interview that one of the problems is that Russia has become strategically very dependent on China, and that's certainly true economically. Now, if you had a resumption of business, as much business as possible, trade and also the financial flows involved between the US and Russia, this would help Russia rebalance itself economically and in terms of its fiscal reserves, in terms of its hard currency holdings, in terms of its dollar holdings, and that would basically prop Russia back up. Once Russia is propped back up, I think that what the Trump administration is looking at is a triangular game. They're looking at a tripolar world of the three largest nuclear states, that's the US, Russia, and China, being effectively in a tense, but nevertheless flexible and fluid three-way competition with part cooperation, part coordination, part competition, between the three of them. And that would somehow, and one would hope then from the new US perspective, to manage those tensions and that competition. I think that's what they really want.
But what would be the ramifications of that not happening? So actually, if they went all in and supported, like you, I agree that right now, people could, if you want to sing the praises of Trump as a MAGA supporter, you could go, look at what Trump's done. It's amazing. He's bringing about peace. What wonderful. Yeah. But at the expense of Ukraine. And actually what he could have done is, it's 7 weeks ago, thrown as much kit as possible to Ukraine, hammer the sanctions even harder against Russia, and brought Russia to its knees relatively quickly, all things considered, and then peed from strength through there with a potential collapse of Russia. So what is it about? So if he wants this tripolar world, what is it that he doesn't want to happen in a bipolar world? I mean, surely if Russia collapsed, the US could come in and help themselves to some of those power vacuums and resources or whatever. So what is it about a China US world that he wants a tripolar world?
I think it's a combination of factors. So there's what motivates Trump himself, what he believes personally. There is a variety of people around him who are also important. And then there are various factions within American conservatism and within American institutions. And I would basically put it like this. My view is that Trump himself is highly likely a well-cultivated asset, not an agent, but an asset of the Russian Federation and he started being cultivated in the 1980s. There's enough evidence of this in terms of, I mean, try to look at it from Trump's point of view, bearing in mind what clearly appears to be his fundamental personality traits. He's very vain, narcissistic, self-interested, loves money, loves luxury, loves beautiful women. I mean, this is basically someone who's an absolute wet dream for influence by a hostile foreign intelligence service, and especially the Russians, because the Russians are world champions in this. Don't underestimate the Russians. The Russians, in my opinion, have the best, most ruthless intelligence service in the world, not in terms of intelligence collection. I think they're actually not the best in that. But in terms of influencing operations, they are number one, because they have no barriers, no moral limits. They'll do anything that works, and they've transformed it into an absolute art form. And so Trump for them is just an easy victim. And so I'm not going to sort of go through all of the evidence that's out there, but we have entire books written on this, long articles, lots of investigative journalism, going back all the way to the 1980s. There's so many statements Trump made on the campaign trail in 2015-16. Already then, he just kept on saying at rallies, wouldn't it be great if we got along with Russia? Wouldn't it be great if we got along with Russia? He said it, I don't know how many times. He was agreeing with Russia on how to handle the situation in Syria all the way back then. Think that he worked with Manafort, and think of Manafort's associations. Think of the fact that he nominated Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. Think of the attitude of Musk towards the Russia-Ukraine war, and the fact that Musk is almost a co-president of the United States at this point. So there is absolutely a pro-Russian state, or Kremlin-friendly, let's say, element to how the United States is being run today. It's just there. It's just obvious.
I'm interviewing Zarina Zabriskie tomorrow on this channel, and she's written a massive Medium article on exactly what you've just been talking about, going back to the 1980s. So just to let the audience know that we'll be joining these dots together that Edward is just talking about there. So yeah, it does appear. So you think that is playing a key role in the decision making of Trump then, obviously?
Of Trump himself, yes, but there are other pieces of the puzzle which are important, because if it were only that, then it wouldn't work. I mean, the US establishment, US society, businesses, there would have been a lot more pushback against Trump if he was simply in-your-face pro-Russian and there's nothing else to him, or nothing else to trying to do that. One other very important component of this are the China hawks that worked at the Pentagon under Trump 1, and that are back in the Pentagon now. It's a number of thinkers who are not, they don't really care about Russia that much. Indeed, they don't care about Europe that much. It's a new it's a new cohort of American strategists who've moved on from Europe and who think China, China, China every day. And they think of nothing else, because for them, in their opinion, this is the next big challenge for US power in the world. It's the ability to contain China. And they look at the facts of the matter in their minds in a very objective and even-handed way, but actually in a way that I consider analytically primitive and wrong. And I'll briefly say why, because it's important. But they simply see, okay, China's got 10 times the population of Russia. It's got 10 times the economy. They can outspend even the United States if they wanted to in some areas. They're a bigger manufacturing powerhouse than the US. So, I mean, this is it. And they will, quote unquote, take over the world if we don't contain them. And Asia anyway is more important, and Europe is sclerotic, and it's a low growth, lazy place that doesn't want to defend itself. So let's just abandon these ungrateful freeloaders and focus on the real game in town, which is China. And then all you have to do with those guys is simply gently seed their thinking and try to push them to be slightly more extreme than they are. So I'm talking from a Russian influence operation perspective here. And then you have them in your pocket, because basically sort of try to have these people be so disinterested in Europe that they no longer even understand what Europe is, how it works, why it matters to America, why it matters to American values, to American history, to all the wars we fought shoulder to shoulder with the Americans. All that is sort of wiped clean off the table. It's very common among that crowd of people to have no gratitude whatsoever for the fact that hundreds of European soldiers died in Afghanistan or Iraq following America's lead in the current generation. They don't care about that. It doesn't count. It really doesn't count. And it's quite shocking that it doesn't count, because you'd think, I mean, that's the number one thing you have within an alliance. It's the most important thing, in fact, is that you have allies who are prepared to send their boys into your wars and who are prepared for some of them never to come back. And a country that has ceased to understand that is a country that is going to lose its alliances sooner or later. And that's exactly the way America is going. The ungratefulness and the, frankly, aggressiveness with which America has treated both Canada and Denmark. Both countries have lost men in the global war on terror, completely following America's lead. Or you look at the attitudes of these same people. So the China hawks, they don't care about Eastern European security either, but Poland made a pretty enormous contribution. I mean, compared to the size of Poland, in the Operation Iraqi Freedom, they were, I think, the fourth largest contingent. I mean, this was pretty serious. Even Ukraine, which was not a treaty ally, sent forces to Afghanistan and had casualties. But all of that is completely wiped off the table in US discourse on purpose by the combined forces of Russian disinformation operations and MAGA disinformation operations, which end up pulling in the same direction, and with so little protection that you can no longer tell, and it's been like that for a while. For everyone who's active online, you know this. Often you can no longer tell whether you're dealing with a Russian bot or a MAGA bot. You don't know anymore whether you're dealing with a very ill-informed Texan or with a government employee who's sitting in an office in St. Petersburg. You can no longer tell the difference. It's merged that much. And so what we have in the US is a merger of different forces, and that's where this becomes dangerous, because that's where it can really determine policy. Is that on the one hand, you have people who are outright pro-Moscow or Moscow-friendly. They actually deliberately out to do things that help Moscow for its own sake. Then you have other people who don't care about Moscow, but they care about containing China, and they will, to a degree, go along in the very same direction. And those are the people that you can fool with a logic of, let's do a reverse Nixon. We're going to ally with Russia in order to contain China. And those people will jump on it immediately, instantly. And there's a precedent for this, by the way, which the Russians used to be very good at exploiting, and it's probably still going to come through to some degree, which is when Russia used to argue towards Western countries, look, just join forces with us because we have the Islamists as a common enemy, ISIS, etc. I mean, Russia was doing propaganda towards Western audiences and to say, look at all the horrible attacks you have on your streets. But we Russians, we know how to deal with ISIS. Look at all the places we've bombed in Syria. Aren't we great? And some voters in Western countries who are tempted by right-wing populist or far-right ideas actually bought into this. And they were saying, the Russians know how to do it. Let's wipe out these horrible Islamists for our enemies. And so this is something that could come back as a smaller issue here. But I would even not be surprised, I'm speculating here, but I would not be surprised if the Russians would pretty soon present themselves as an effective partner in combating international drug trafficking, since it's such a big topic in the US. So if I wanted to manipulate the Americans further, I would say, well, don't worry. Here we have very interesting SVR reports about how the cartels work in Mexico. We know everything about them because we have great intel. So here, take our probably fake, distorted intelligence on these matters, and some Americans probably would lap it up. So effectively, America is opening itself up to being voluntarily subverted by the Russian state, and that's where this is going.
Yeah, there's so much going on there. So on the one hand, there's this, as you point out, the Russians are are distracting the Americans away from Russia and saying, look, here's a bigger enemy. You want to get, these are the guys you want to worry about. So then they're not worrying about Russia. So then Russia can go about doing whatever they want to do, while the US is then being diverted by China, while at the same time, and you had the Chinese envoy to the EU the other day saying that it was appalling the way that the White House treated Zelensky, et cetera, et cetera. So you got China trying to peel the US away from the EU. And then that allows them, that's part of the PLA approach to taking Taiwan, which is, you know, if we can decouple the US from the EU, then they don't have the massive alliance that they need to deal with China. And then you've got the US with Trump being fundamentally doesn't understand alliances, right? Because he sees, this is how I interpret it, correct me if I'm wrong, but he sees everything in zero-sum games. So positive sum games where if we work together and we both benefit. He doesn't really understand that. Someone was explaining the other day that it's almost like Trump doesn't understand how, this is why he talks about trade deficits all the time. He doesn't understand trade. Like if we do a trade, so Edward, if you were like selling me a packet of sweets, right, and I give you £1 for a packet of sweets, like you benefit because you're getting £1, and I benefit because I'm getting the sweets I want for a deal that I see is fit, right? Which is I'm giving you this money because I think these sweets are worth £1. So we both actually gain from that. So trade is actually a gain. But if you don't understand that and see trade deficits as just automatically negative, rather than actually everyone's gaining from these trades going on, then you don't understand trade, you don't understand alliances where you're working together for a common goal. And actually that then feeds into an isolationism, which then feeds into peeling away from the EU, NATO, WHO, all of these alliances. You have an isolated US, and that's to the benefit of both Russia and China. And we have a fragmented world, and it's almost as if the EU is the only kind of entity standing up for democracy or something. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yes, exactly. But unfortunately, it gets a bit darker than that if you consider.
Oh, great.
If you consider the lessons of history. The idea that one should so being against trade, or if you like, wanting to have autarky, is not a new idea. It's an old idea, and it is an idea which was pursued by basically by fascist regimes. Mussolini's Italy wanted to be self-sufficient. The Nazi German idea of economics was that you would conquer the territories you need, that have the resources you need, right, and exploit the conquered lands and exploit the conquered peoples as slaves, and you would then be self-sufficient. And then when you're self-sufficient, nobody can hurt you. So if you take a highly paranoid, aggressive, nationalistic frame of reference, the reason why you don't want to trade with others then is because you think you're vulnerable to being cut off. That they trade with you for a while and then they cut you off and then you're in trouble. So if you take that effectively sort of paranoia-informed way of looking at the world, you may conclude in the other sense that the only way to be secure is to have enough for yourself, and to have enough for yourself, instead of going about it through exchange, you'll go about it through conquest. So it's important to understand that historically, actually, a lot of countries felt that way and behaved that way. The traditional European overseas empires, including the UK, including France, etc. I mean, we were all trying before the Second World War to have material security and resource security thanks to foreign possessions.
Interesting. Yeah, of course.
European powers used to be at each other's throats all the time about, who's going to control this bit of Africa or that bit of Africa, and who's going to get the copper and the rubber and what have you, who's going to get the oil, who's going to have control of the oil, what's the best way to control oil, is it trade or is it war? So what Trump is doing here is that he's pulling certainly the United States and maybe other parts of the world as well back towards that considerably darker phase of human history where the major powers simply do not want to base their interactions with smaller states on trust and on rules, but would rather base it on the absolute security of physical control backed up by military force. So that's the problem we're looking at, and that's where everything ties in.
Greenland, Canada, exactly. Greenland, Panama.
And Panama.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you imagine a Russian style or Putin style imperialism, but applied to the case of the United States of America, you would seek to control the entirety of the northern half of the Western Hemisphere, meaning
Yeah.
ranging from the Panama
Holy
Canal to the
shit.
Arctic
Yeah.
Ocean. That's what you would do. So you would subjugate Canada for its resources. You would subjugate Greenland for its resources. You would subjugate Mexico and the Central American states. And you would cut everything off at the Panama Canal. So the canal, of course, itself is useful because it means you can cross from one ocean to the next for your trade and for people who want to trade with you. But south of Panama, of course, it's the narrowest point, so it's militarily defensible. And you don't need to bother about South America. Forget about them. It's quite far away and it's not really that much of an issue. So an America that behaves in an imperialist way would be hegemonic in what I would call the Northern Americas. So from the Panama Canal to the Arctic. And Trump talks about it that way explicitly. I mean, just yesterday, he was saying, again, talking about Canada as the 51st state, with Musk chipping in, just throw in Greenland. I mean, this is a completely imperialist, expansionist, revisionist way of talking, and the Canadians are taking it very seriously. So at this point, people are not expecting the US to attack Canada militarily. I still think that's a remote possibility, thank God. But using economic coercion basically to subjugate and destabilize Canada so that they would basically just give up and say, all right, well, we'll make concessions, or we'll maybe even just follow your politics. And this is exactly the way Putin went about treating his neighbors before he resorted to full-blown military force. In the years prior to 2014, it was a regular occurrence that Russia would use economic coercion, economic bullying against the likes of Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. It was completely his playbook to try to get them to fall into line. And he did it with Belarus successfully. He did it with Armenia successfully, just that Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova didn't want to fold. So we're seeing Trump going in that direction. And so in that sense, they understand each other. Trump and Putin have a similar worldview almost. I mean, that's the thing that we need to consider. And so then the question is, well, how do you define the US interest within that? And the problem is that, of course, I think they accept already that the US economy is going to change. It's going to rebalance. It's going to be based on different principles. The stock market is going down. They're beginning to openly say, well, yeah, there will be some adjustments, some pain. I mean, this is a complete change from Trump 1. Now we have the Trump administration openly telling the public in the US that they should expect economic pain. Now, if a government does that, telling its population, especially a population as fickle as the Americans, who always pay a lot of attention to the stock market and inflation and what have you, you're going to have to suffer economic hardship first. I mean, it's pretty rare that you say that to a population in a democratic state, unless you want to mobilize them for a difficult trial or possibly for war. And in liberal democracies, we only do that when it's absolutely necessary. We do that when we feel very threatened from a foreign power. That's when we go to our people and say, we may have to have economic pain. We need painful adjustment. The Americans are doing this for no reason. They're not threatened. They're not going to be attacked. I mean, it's a nuclear superpower. They're in a very safe location. They don't need any of this. All the Americans have to do really is just stick to their existing alliance commitments and just make allies pay a bit more. That would have been sort of a continuation of Trump 1. And of course, Ukraine would remain a difficult case. Taiwan would remain a difficult case. But that's what America could do, and that's what I think the rational American policy actually would be, because America does benefit a lot from its alliances, a lot more than Trump gives it credit for. I think he's been cultivated and maybe a little bit brainwashed, and I think partly it comes from his lack of education, but partly also from spending too much time talking with Russians. He doesn't understand the Western way. I would even say he's a non-Western leader. He's not even a Western person. in his mindset. He doesn't understand how Western prosperity comes along. We are no longer a system which is based on empires and territorial possessions. We are a system that is prosperous because we have networks, global networks of companies and individuals that do business with each other across the world.
But of course,
that's the West.
But that the notion of globalism has become this pejorative that Americans often, or some Americans use. It's like, oh, you're such a globalist. Yeah, I'm a globalist because that's good and it brings about prosperity and it brings about positive sum gain. So what we have is this incredible. I mean, this is such fascinating talk, Edward. And goodness me, so much to talk about from here. But the idea that you've got on the one hand this isolationist in terms of international cooperation, it's an isolationist but expansionist in terms of, so if we aren't going to cooperate with people, then we need these. So we're not going to cooperate with Canada, therefore we need to own Canada. We're not going to cooperate with Panama, therefore we need to own Panama. That kind of approach in Greenland. So it's this imperialistic expansionism together with an isolationism that the Trump administration appears to be going for. But like you, I don't think Trump is nearly clever enough to, like, he understands the basis of power, and he can understand that would be a good thing, but actually the thinking is coming from others around him, the dangerous people, the Project 2025. I don't know exactly who it would be. I've got a few names that I would throw into the hat there, but I think there's a dangerous administration that he's got around him that he didn't have in Trump 1, because he wasn't expecting to win. No one expected him to win. So it was actually, he won and then had to have the foundation of the established GOP, the Republican Party, that was kind of like, okay, well, you've won. Well, here are the people you need to put in. And they were kind of establishment figures. So none of this kind of crazy stuff was going on. But now you've got a whole, they've had 4 years to prepare this imperialistic administration that is in place. And you would think, this is 2025. How can this happen? But of course, it happens if you can make it happen. And if you start taking away all the checks and balances that are in place in the American government to stop it from happening.
Sure. I think that, I mean, there's so many layers to explore here. I think one thought I would put forward, well, two. One is a process of forgetting why so many successive presidential administrations of the United States kept all of those alliances alive and effectively acted as the linchpin power for the international system. Why did Americans keep on making that choice? Why did America's elites keep on making that choice? And I think in a sense it lasted for so long that a lot of American thinkers even forgot why they were doing that, why it was a good idea. I mean, this is an issue of the passage of generations. The people who were in charge in the 50s and 60s understood exactly what they were doing and why, because they were traumatized by the horrors of the 2 world wars, and they felt close to Europe, and they could see Europe traumatized by the horrors of the world wars, and for that matter also East Asian people traumatized by the Second World War. And so first of all, there was a spirit of never again, but there was also very important lessons that were learned at the time that were, I think, self-evident to decision makers then, that have ceased to become self-evident. I'll just give you one example, because this is something I bounced off a very senior European Union official, and he actually didn't get it, so I was a bit surprised. But if you look at how the EU evolved, and you look at the narratives around it, they don't give full justice to the thinking that was there at the very start. Nor is there really necessarily the best theorization of why the EU is a good idea. But here's one. European states used to go to war against each other all the time. That everybody knows. But there's a specific one here, because you could ask, well, why did the EU project start as an economic community? And the reason is that a big factor, not the only one, but a big factor behind a lot of the wars and tensions between European states in the 19th century were competition for resources and competition for export markets. If you had an empire back in the 19th century, you knew you could export your goods. And you also knew that you probably couldn't export much. Let's say if you were British, you would have known that you can't export that much to French Indochina or to French Algeria. But no matter, you're going to export to British India. Once you get rid of all of that, once you lose the colonies, but even before then, you may as well avoid all of the tensions that are associated with competing for export markets and competing for critical resources that Europeans don't have, notably oil, by working together instead of against one another. If you can remove those irritants, you're much less likely to create an incentive for European countries to go to war against each other. It's that simple. So instead of saying like politicians have been saying for far too long without further explanation, well, we're simply doing this because we want to have common prosperity among Europeans, or something bland like that. The real explanation, actually, why the European project is a good idea and why broader globalization and trade liberalization is a good idea, is to avoid and even, in a sense, prohibit negative sum, not just zero sum, but negative sum competition between states. If states are absolutely convinced that the next country is going to screw them, is going to capture the next market before they do, and then basically shut it down. If you're convinced that the next country, as soon as it gets its hands on the next oil well, is going to deny you access to it, they won't even sell to you because they think the next thing is that you're going to war. So they don't want you to have oil at all. It's not about the money, it's about the quantity. So I think that those considerations really show that there were very, very strong reasons why we did all of those things. It's also to avoid, basically avoid creating incentives for war. And that is what America is now abandoning. And that's what Trump is now abandoning. And his terrifying logic is that he doesn't care. America will be fine because it's large enough and powerful enough. And it will especially be large enough and powerful enough if it can furthermore control Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal. And the terrifying thing there is that that's probably even true. So that's the really sobering thing here, is that, I mean, try to imagine how anyone could coerce a Northern American empire. They will be able to be isolationist and to retrench from most of the world. And if they decide they don't care that Russia's invading half of Eastern Europe and China is invading Taiwan, if they decide they don't care, and they are self-sufficient on their continent in terms of oil and precious resources and food and
which is why
everything else.
they're now big on like microchips. Obviously, the Biden Chips and Science Act was a good thing anyway from a national security point of view. But actually, Trump is going to be surely absolutely going down the pathway of generating microchips from inside the US and therefore not caring about Taiwan, which he's already said he doesn't really care about Taiwan. In fact, they sell us, he's annoyed that the trade relationship between Taiwan and microchips, etc., etc. So yeah, once they get that, then they become a completely self-contained unit.
Exactly. And so then this connects with the third category of Americans, or of American thought, which is somewhat on board with what Trump is doing, or is going along with it. And those are the actual isolationists. So those who want retrenchment. And there's obviously, it's a spectrum of views how isolationist America should be. But we have to give, to do justice to the fact that the global war on terror in particular, I wouldn't say exhausted America, that's a bit too strong, but it did have costs on American society. And if you look at US discourse, you can tell. All these complaints, people, screaming at the top of their lungs about, oh, forever wars, picking fights we don't understand, the other side of the world. I mean, all of that. And we have to give the ordinary American voter his due. I mean, it's fair enough. Going into Iraq was a strange thing. And for those who went out, it was probably largely an unpleasant experience, not to mention those who were injured or saw their mates die. And so why should you want to have that again? So I think one thing which is important to understand about contemporary America, it's very clear, and Mark Milley made the point very openly. He was the former chief of staff of the US Armed Forces under Trump 1. He said this country has had it with wars, literally. So my sense, quite frankly, is that the America of today doesn't have much stomach for going to war at all, which is pretty ominous for Europeans as well, because if America doesn't have the stomach to go to war, then how can they defend allies? Because the whole point about defending allies is that you have to be prepared to go to war.
Which is what happened. So that what? Sorry to interrupt, but what happened in World War II, of course, is you had the Charles Lindbergh America First isolationism that was actually prevailing, and it wasn't until Japan attacked in Pearl Harbor that forced them into war. But otherwise, you know, you could imagine an alternate history where the US was then, as it appears to want to be now, and it's only being forced into World War II that they became this globalist entity, but that actually since then there is maybe been trying to recede from that, and you know, wanting to take hold of or take control of Canada is against Article 1 and Article 2 of NATO. You can argue that already the US has failed in adhering to NATO articles. Like we talk about Article 5, but actually, I think the US. So if we sorry, this is a long interruption. If we look at Articles 1 and 2 of NATO, the parties undertake to set forth in the Charter of the UN to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain their international relations from the threat or use of force in any matter inconsistent with the purposes of the UN. Okay, use of force. Article 2, parties will contribute toward the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions, which arguably they're not, by bringing about a better understanding of the principles upon which the institutions are founded, and by promoting conditions of stability and well-being. They will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any or all of them. And they're not doing that. Literally, they are doing economic coercion. And so, yeah.
They are. And just please read Article 3 as well.
Yeah. I was going to go to do that. So, yeah, Article 3, in order to more effectively achieve the objectives of the treaty, the parties separately and jointly, by means of continuous and effective self-help and mutual aid, will maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack.
If you take all of the articles together, yes, I mean, that's actually a very good point. And actually, credit to you, Jonathan, because I don't think I've seen someone else argue that America is already violating the Washington Treaty in terms of its first two articles. Certainly, you're the first person to say that to me. And I confess, I worked at NATO. I know the treaty quite well. I hadn't even thought about it. No, but this is really an excellent point. So really, great credit to you. I think this is worth digging into and worth making the point. I mean, not that Trump will listen.
And well, but then it feeds into, but what my larger point was going to be is, one, that I think the US has actually fallen foul of Articles 1 and 2, and with Canada particularly, and you can argue with Greenland as well. And those are with NATO allies. So then this gets to the point where you've got motivation for Trump, even further motivation for Trump to get out of NATO.
Yeah, it could be, but I mean, I think, you know, Trump is not.
Although that would take Congress and a supermajority, but yeah,
I think Trump has already put one foot of America out of NATO, and he doesn't. We'll see. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but a lot of European governments already believe that America would not necessarily come to their assistance if they were attacked. I mean, the point is that people are not sure anymore. I'm not saying that it's completely ruled out. I think that, you know, I think it would be very stupid and reckless of the Russians, for example, tomorrow to make the bet that America is completely out and then try to drop bombs on Warsaw, because I think if they did that, you could see America flip the other way. I wouldn't rule it out. I wouldn't rule out America being dragged into a European war against Russia if Russia was stupid enough to go all out, to do a massive in-your-face, large-scale armed attack, especially if it were against a country like Poland, which America has some strong connections with, and including even this administration. They're actually singing the praises of Poland quite often because it spent so much on defense and bought lots of US equipment. So we're in a very, very difficult, very unclear gray zone of what remains of the NATO commitment. What can be said is that it is the wise and safe option for European governments to plan and to equip themselves and to prepare for scenarios in which they would have to face Russia alone. That's absolutely clear.
Do you think there'll be a European analog to NATO? Do you think that because where I was going to take this conversation is, where do you think the EU goes from here in this new age of empires? Like people like Guy Verhofstadt, the former Belgian Prime Minister and EU's kind of mainstay, he has talked about in one of his books, that we are living in this new age of empires, and the EU needs to forge its own position in the world, knowing that you've got a US, Chinese, and Russian empire. And then it's interesting with Britain on the outside going, well, where the hell do we fit in? But if there's this peace deal that takes place, if that actually you start seeing this gradual peace, will you get European nations saying, well, we don't need to now raise 800 billion euros for, look, where do you see EU's role in the world?
Okay, I'll say normatively, I think Europe, absolutely, Europeans in general at the national level, and then also through the EU, absolutely need to do a lot more for their defense and their security, and they have to assume that America is no longer a reliable ally, and that means that we all have to increase our defense budgets, whether it's the UK, Germany, Poland, everyone. We all have to do a lot more. Poland's on a pretty good trajectory, but frankly, so far it's the only European country I can think of that's on a properly serious trajectory. And even Poland has to plan for the possibility of American withdrawal. I mean, it's one leg of their strategy so far is to have the Americans bilaterally there in Poland, pretty significant force presence. So we all have to do that. I think it's going to be difficult for the UK and France. I think neither London or Paris have fully woken up to the difficulties that are coming, and I think there's a risk that Britain will be tempted to sort of do the splits across the Atlantic and try to stay on side of the Americans while being friendly to Europe and sort of,
because we're not getting tariffed, right? So that's a problem for Starmer. Is like, well, if he starts a trade war with the EU, which is part of his, like, he hates, I think he sees the EU as more of an enemy than Russia personally. But if he starts a trade war with the EU, which I think is pretty likely, UK is in this position where, like, we'd like to be really supportive of the EU, but if we criticize the US for that kind of approach and stand with our EU brothers and sisters, then the US is going to tariff us, and our economy is so fragile at the moment that is not cool. But then if we go all in with the US, then we are not standing with our brothers and sisters in Europe, and that could, so exactly right. We're caught between these two entities.
Yes, and of course not for the first time, but I think, and there's a lot of merit in, or there would be a lot of merit in my view, in the UK actually continuing to do mostly as it has done, but nevertheless basically developing a plan B. I mean, that's really where enhanced security comes from. Britain has assets that America appreciates: military intelligence. There's a significant, strategically important US presence in the UK, ranging from early warning to air bases and so on. And the defense industries of Britain and America are more strongly integrated than any other than any other bilateral defense relationship that America has. So there's also that. But the UK defense industry also works very closely with Europeans. So Britain really does have a foot on each continent, which is interesting. And I think Britain tries diplomatically to minimize irritants with the US by doing something I'd refer to as diplomatic mirroring, which is to sometimes copy some of the things that America is doing on purpose so as to look similar to America, so as to look more palatable, more compatible, and more friendly to the US. And some of those choices might be okay. Like, for example, it looks like the UK wants to largely copy America's approach to artificial intelligence and not really go the regulatory way of Europe. There might be a couple of examples where doing that is okay. It might even work. But in terms of security and defense, I think there is no escaping the thing the UK really, really should do this time, and which successive British governments never do. And that is to spend proper money on defense, because British governments bend over backwards every damn time to avoid that. They always try to cut corners. They always try to reduce costs. And as a result, the armed forces of the UK are no longer so well regarded. I mean, they're well regarded for their quality. They're not well regarded for their readiness in terms of equipment and inventory, and force size is at a historical low. And you can't fight a real war that way, not against a peer enemy. I mean, what force size would the UK be able to deploy to Eastern Europe if there were a wider war with Russia? A brigade?
Do you think there would be, though? Do you think, because this is something I'm fascinated by, because Ukraine have fundamentally, and I would actually say, and I said this to you this morning on Blue Sky, and I've said this to my audience before, that I've been critical of the Biden administration for not giving enough stuff, not giving the right stuff at the right time. This war could have come to a satisfactory conclusion earlier than it will do, right? But the ramifications of the drip feeding approach has been at the cost of Ukrainian lives. So that's the terrible part of this. At the cost of Ukrainian lives, the drip feeding of the Biden administration has meant that Russia's been more fundamentally attrited, both economically and militarily, than it otherwise would have been if we had gone for a quick win type thing. And that means I think Russia would struggle to do anything for a long time. That's meaningful in conventional warfare. So I don't know whether Russia would be able to carry on past. The only way they'd be able to do that is if Ukraine completely capitulated and they used Ukrainian people and materiel to bolster their own armed forces, then go into Poland. But Poland's now looking at getting another 100,000. They're the only ones really serious about arming up at the moment in terms of Europe, the wider European continent. But I don't know. So my opinion is that inadvertently Biden has actually caused the more fundamental degradation of Russia, both economically and militarily. And that's a frustration with Trump, is that he was handed that. He's handed this situation where you could then put the nails in the coffin of Russia, and he's actually resurrected Russia. And that's a deep frustration I feel. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, there are many forces around Europe that are undermanned and don't have the capacities they need. But it looks like Poland is at least one of the ones that is serious about this.
It is, but just to react to your point, I think what Biden did was ultimately a little bit worse than that, because yes, you can sort of try to slow the war down, or to sort of make it into a war of attrition where Russia doesn't lose too quickly, so that the scenario of Russia deciding it has nothing to lose and starts using nuclear weapons, so that threat is minimized. That was clearly what they were thinking in Washington, and people would think that in other capitals as well. So as soon as you have to assign a small but net positive probability to Russia just deciding to go nuclear, and assuming that you're terrified by that prospect, which sounds reasonable to be terrified by that prospect, then you will err on the side of caution with respect to that, which means that you don't allow the Ukrainians to win quickly, which means that, roughly speaking, you give Ukraine half of what you could give them instead of all of what you could give them. But there is a problem with that, and that is that it's not only is the variable of adjustment Ukrainian lives, Ukrainian cities, etc. The other variable of adjustment is, in effect, that too. If you grind the Russians down too slowly, you give them enough time to keep on mobilizing new cohorts of soldiers, and you give time to their defense industrial base to start mass production. And then you have a serious problem, and we do have a serious problem. And I'd like to point out that by the end of 2023, this was becoming apparent. So there was a big change in the threat perceptions of European governments, starting from the end of 23. In the beginning of 23, people still thought, okay, we're boiling the frog. The Russians are going to lose so many men. They're going to get discouraged. This is going to end up somewhere, some sort of stalemate. But in the course of 2023, the Russians increased their defense production by so much and showed so much determination to increase. And bear in mind, this is still well below a full war economy like in the Second World War, but it's a lot compared to what we Europeans are used to in peacetime. By the end of 23, we had military leaders in Europe beginning to say, actually, if the war stopped, Russia could reconstitute its forces and be a formidable threat to the rest of Europe within a 5-year time frame. That's the discussion that started to go around. And if you look at even more recent discussions, that time frame could even come sooner. The tragedy with a ceasefire now is that you have to imagine the Russian defense industry running full bore.
Yeah.
And so the moment you stop fighting, all you have to do is wait literally just a few months, and you'll be swimming on the Russian side, you'll be swimming in an ocean of shells and tanks that are not being blown up anymore because there's no war. And so you could reconstitute quite quickly a very dangerous, formidable force. And on top of that, you have combat experience, which we on the European side do not have, at least not that kind of combat experience, and definitely not on that scale. The Russians are now very good at drone warfare. They're better than we are because they have more practical experience. Of course, we have the Ukrainians. If we save the Ukrainian army, and we should, frankly, European governments, we have to do everything we can to save the Ukrainian army, help as much of it as possible to survive, and help its know-how and expertise survive, because we're going to need them. We're going to need them as very close colleagues and allies.
Which leads into why European politicians might well be saying we genuinely need to get Ukraine into the EU as soon as possible, actually from a security point of view, from like, if it is a zero-sum game. If we lose them to Russia, they gain that expertise and, you know, et cetera. So yeah, we need them with us, not with them.
That's absolutely clear. And you know, it may be that it's difficult to get them fully into the EU because Hungary might again be a problem. Slovakia might object. Others might object. We do have to work as well through coalition of the willing structures. I mean, that's the name of the game in Europe today, is coalition of the willing. We have to do a lot more through coalitions of the willing, because the EU institutions, we should use the EU institutions for those European friends who are in the EU. Use the EU as much as you can. But there's a lot that needs to be done that will not even be possible working through the EU. But we can still do it through coalitions of the willing, through national governments taking aligned decisions to reach common goals. And that is what is happening. And that is the institutional answer to how the UK can fit in. You can have a coalition of the willing involving the UK and several EU states. It's not, there's nothing illegal about that. You just do it. So we just act together like allies, and we will manage. And the same will be true for helping Ukraine. There's a lot that can be done to help Ukraine prosper and rebuild and keep a solid army. And then that's the direction of travel. That is absolutely what Europeans are going to do and have to do. And any time that there's a threat of a Hungarian or Slovak veto, we're going to have to do it outside of the EU framework.
And I guess as we meander to the end here, like, what are you hopeful about where the EU, where Europe is in terms of its response of late? I mean, it seems to have woken up. Is it a beast that is it a sleeping beast, or is it a sleeping sloth? Do you know what I mean? Like, do you have hope that the EU can come up with the goods when necessary, given that you have Hungary and to some degree Slovakia being eaten away from Russian thought from the inside, and maybe Romania even?
I think that there's a stronger awakening among pretty much all the security professionals I know, and I know that this spills over into people who are actually in positions of power. That there is a new realization that a lot more needs to be done. Much bigger efforts need to be done than before. I think that incoming German Chancellor Merz is serious and genuine about having proper German defense budgets in future, and that's actually going to happen. But even then, I'm still stunned to see, for example, the UK government in this incredibly dangerous time in world history, presenting a really, frankly, very small increase in defense spending, going up to 2.5% of GDP, coming from a level of something like 2.2%. So it's a very minor change, and presenting that as being somehow impressive. And that's the bad old ways of British politics, and that has to stop. I mean, would like to suggest...
Well, you've got to do that outside of the budget, because there isn't a space in the budget, and that would cause, because the general population, the problem is with the democracy is you're living on 4-year, 5-year cycles, and so if you take that money from hospitals or whatever, the population is going to go absolutely insane. So there needs to be some other mechanism. I know that Germany can do that because they've had budgetary constraints and borrowing previously, and that they're going to release that, then suddenly they can borrow loads. So the question is, well, you know, is it important enough for us to borrow loads to do that?
Well, I mean, look, this is my research topic. I wrote my PhD on defense economics, so
nice.
I think, you know,
you're the man.
Fundamentally, This is absolutely doable. This is absolutely doable. But what happens is this: when countries feel acutely threatened, they start talking completely differently. So the very same people who would have said in a previous situation, there's not enough space in the budget, we can't cut budgets to hospitals and schools. All of this, people all of a sudden transform into saying, well, we can just increase taxes and everybody's going to pay because everybody wants to defend the nation. And that's the end of the discussion. I mean, it's that easy to do if you have enough coherence at the top. And what I would like to suggest for the UK is to move already, not completely, but to move halfway towards a wartime coalition government, because that's the way Britain has historically overcome exactly the problems you mean.
Interesting, yeah.
Which are that you're in a tight political game and everybody is thinking about the next election. And are budgets really that tight? Well, they're only tight if you absolutely point blank refuse to increase taxation. And if you're already borrowed to the hilt, which Britain has relatively high public debt. So all of those things are constraints, it's true. But just think of it. All you would have to do is increase a personal income tax by 1 or 2 percentage points across the board for everybody in the country, and you would have just a ton of money flowing in. And I mean, and you wouldn't have to cut schools and hospitals. Leave them with the budgets they have. They'd continue to grow in real terms or along with GDP. Try to think of the national budget as take everything as a percent of GDP and then keep those percentages fixed the way they are today. So you don't cut. It's going to continue to grow. As long as the economy grows, everything grows. NHS will grow, education will grow. But what you do now is you simply say defense is going to go from 2.2 to 3.6, let's say. 3.6 seems to be a good number for the UK, according to some analyses I've seen, approximately 3.6, 3.7 for a few years. Is it a fair chunk of money? Yes, it's more than 1 percentage point of GDP. But how much is it really for the taxpayer? We're talking paying maybe 2% more tax than before, 2.5% more tax than before. That's all it takes. That's all it takes.
I got frustrated that at the beginning of this war, there was an energy crisis caused by the war. And BP are energy producers and energy distributors. So the whole process of getting energy to someone's house, they were making record profits while at the same time saying, oh, we have to put up prices because of the energy crisis. And they're making record profits. And the BP, the finance secretary or whatever from BP said to a meeting of shareholders, we are making more, we have more cash than we know what to do with. So when you've got like a war that's causing prices to go up and then companies taking advantage of that and then screwing over, it appears, the consumer to the point where Ofgem, the regulator for the energy market in the UK, had to start a charity to help pay people who couldn't afford their energy bills when BP and British Gas are making record profits. You're like, maybe a windfall tax there might have been quite nice, to underwrite a defense, for example, or at that time to underwrite the fact that prices have gone nuts, but doing something about that. But yeah, there are other ways that we could approach this.
There are, and I think it's very important for members of the public to know this. I mean, across the Western world, maybe not every single country, but most countries, most governments spent considerably more fighting the effects of the COVID pandemic than they have spent on strengthening their defense in the face of potential future wars. That's easy to look up, relatively easy to look up. A lot of European governments spent more counteracting the effect of the energy price and energy supply disruptions that happened in the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022 than they have spent on increased defense spending, at least so far. I mean, there's several examples like this. And or look at the German discussion. So for all the positive things I was saying about Merz agreed with the SPD, the German Social Democrats, they're probably going to have a coalition together, that there would be a 500 billion euro special fund for what? For infrastructure, not for defense spending, for civilian infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong. Germany currently needs a lot of new infrastructure investment, and it's a good Keynesian type policy, and then the way the global economy is going, Germany probably needs something like that, and probably other European countries need things like that as well. But the fact is, with 500 billion euros over 10 years, Germany could do the entire transformation to its armed forces that it needs to do. But instead, the headline 500 billion is going to go to civilian infrastructure. So what this proves is our own Western governments, time and again, and Poland's been the only exception so far, time and again, they will spend gigantic amounts of money. They will mobilize enormous amounts of money for things that they think might lose in the next election, or might severely damage public support or things like that. They will absolutely do it. There's still a lack of appreciation for how much has to go into defense. But these other examples, from fighting COVID, fighting energy price shocks, Germany's super fund for civilian infrastructure, all of those prove that money can be found when people really want to find it. And it is the absolute duty for all Europeans to insist. I would like all European citizens, I'd like every listener to this program, wherever you are in a Western country, to basically lobby your political representatives, member of parliament, your government, whoever it is, whoever cares to listen, to say that you want a higher defense budget because you want your country to be properly defended, and you're ready to go up to 3 or even 4% of GDP if necessary, because that will always be cheaper than how much we'll have to spend if we're actually at war.
Yeah, and this is it. It's like defense spending is an insurance policy, and because it's an insurance policy, we'll never need to draw on it, and so you never want to spend more on it. But of course, the closer you get, the more threatening it becomes, and this is why, as the shit hits a fan now, people are like, okay, let's spend. But otherwise, you're like, no, it's just insurance, and don't need to spend. And it's a difficult one to explain to the electorate that expenditure needs to happen now, particularly in peacetime. That's a difficult sell when the electorate's going to go, hey, I've got kids that are going to schools and I want them, we're not at war, so yeah.
But I honestly think that voters are ready tomorrow, are ready immediately to accept.
I think we are now. Yeah.
The blockage does not come from voters. The blockage comes from the politicians themselves, because you have to understand how they operate. The way they operate is they don't ask voters. What they do is they have focus groups and opinion polls, and they think that they know how to manage through this, basically, but they don't actually lead. Public opinion is not something that a genuine statesman does not follow public opinion. He shapes public opinion. If you go to the nation as a leader and you say, we have an absolutely massive cataclysmic threat heading for us if we don't move now, and I am going to take the country forward, and I ask you to support me. A sort of Kennedy, don't ask what the country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, or a Churchillian type of motivation, whatever works. But those do work. We know from history those do work. You can mobilize a nation. And I would rather see the likes of the UK, France, Italy, and others talk to their publics now and make the case for going from, say, 2% of GDP on defense to, let's say, 4%, which is still a peacetime level, but it's a high preparedness level, rather than having additional disasters. Because war or no war, or wider war or no wider war, the future that's coming to us very, very quickly is that European nations are going to lose agency. If we have on the one side a highly armed, combat experienced, angry, revanchist Russia in the east, and we have an unreliable America that is following its own power ambitions in its own hemisphere and cutting dirty deals with the Russians and maybe even with the Chinese, where does that leave us in Europe? The fact is, it's going to be divide and rule against us. Europeans need to rise together to be strong. And the answer here is not, I would say, to say, well, the EU will fix this. The issue is every individual European country has to be aware of the fact that our family of nations, we're not one block, we're more like a family with everybody's a little bit different and has his own individuality. We need every family member to stand up and be strong, and then we can be a strong team. So I see the national level coming first, and then the coalition, the European coalition level, as well as the European Union level, and maybe also the European political community level, coming in together to tie everybody together. But what we need is strong European nations that stand for European values and for the collective security of our continent and populations. That's what we need. And we have to want to win this. We have to want to have agency and direction over what happens to our continent, because we're all interconnected, and it cannot be good for us that Ukraine is subjugated, for example. I mean, our goal has to be that we have to be able to pick up the phone to Vladimir Putin and tell him to back the fuck off, otherwise we're going to rip his head off. That's what Europe needs to be able to do.
Which I believe is actually written in one of the European policies, I think, in that way. That was geopolitical technical speak there. No, I completely agree. Well, look, Edward, I'm going to just do a couple of thanks, if you don't mind. Just the people who have given super chats to the channel. Thank you to Johnny Nedregard. Thank you to Johnny Christensen. Some Norwegian and Danish love there. And we've got a couple of comments from Goose Springsteen. I think we need to get away from from defense as a percentage spending target to a capability target, e.g. 120,000 army, 500 tanks, etc. The percentage target is arbitrary and doesn't actually guarantee any particular capability. I think it's also worth remembering, I know you're British, Goose, so I and maybe you've got something to say about this, Edward, but I always think it's somewhat unfair that the UK is expected to spend the equivalent of, say, I don't know, Slovakia in terms of percentage terms, but we're an island and we're a nuclear nation. So we have to spend on nuclear, which is incredibly expensive, and we have to spend on a navy because we're an island in a way that other maybe landlocked NATO nations don't have to, and an army and an air force. And although NATO is about kind of coming together and you can specialize, and maybe like the Nordic nations have done this actually really well recently, but the UK is at a bit of a disadvantage, like France is, you know, in having to spend in ways that other nations won't have to, and it's just more expensive for us to have armed forces because we're a nuclear nation and an island. But anyway, that's just my thought.
Just briefly on that, I mean, here's the problem with this. I mean, of course, your view is right that what matters most at the end of the day is what's called the output side, so the actual capabilities. So that's absolutely right. So fully agree with Goose here. But there's also a political dimension to this, and that is how much effort is one putting into it. And the second question is, are the resources sufficient to guarantee the capability targets? And in effect, it's a three-way problem. And the reason why percent of GDP survives in the discussion is because it's actually necessary. It's necessary for political reasons, both domestically and at the alliance level. So it's not that the point is wrong. It's that you have to take the broader perspective. The capabilities are what matter, but you have to make sure that the resources to do that are actually going to be there. And in the case of the UK, for example, the number I said before was not random. I mean, there was an estimate out there. I can't remember who produced it, whether it was Russi or others, but looking at more like 3.7% of GDP as what would be necessary. But that was based on an analysis of necessary capabilities. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is you can't have a coalition with friendly states if you have one country spending 4% of GDP, the other spending 1% of GDP.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll be felt to be unfair. That's also.
Yeah. And just Goose adds, does Ed think it will ever be possible to get the UK government to remove Trident? So that's our new nuclear deterrent from the defense budget, as in the past. It grossly distorts things as is, which is kind of what I was talking about with regard to nuclear. I understand it, although I tried to look into this and I couldn't find evidence, but I was told by my friend in the Navy, I live in a very naval area, my dad was in the Navy, etc. But my mate was telling me at the pub recently, he's just come out of the Navy, and I said, why does the UK defense budget, why are we spending so much but appear to get so little? And he said, pensions, but he said also nuclear used to be a part of the foreign office or the foreign department or whatever, and it was then brought under the defense, and then that caused a massive, it takes a massive chunk out. So yeah, that's kind of what Goose is going to there.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, look, personally, I'm interested in what actually works militarily, and then also it has to be politically feasible, which is why I'm okay with the percent of GDP way of looking at things. But this here would be basically an accounting trick, to be honest.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
if it helps to do it, why not? But I think a lot of people would find it really bizarre that the most powerful weapon in the arsenal is not in the defense budget.
yeah.
It would look rather odd.
Well, then, to end on this, then, is there an appetite for the European Defence Force that would be separate from NATO? Well, what are your thoughts on the European Defence Force? How is it at all feasible? Is it probable? And is it something that people in defence circles are advocating for generally?
Just a few weeks ago, I would have said the probability is zero, literally zero. Some people refer to this as European army. But to be clear, what that would imply would be to merge national armies into a single European army, or possibly to create a common European defense force, which would be multinational. But I think the real point here is to understand what is actually needed. What is actually needed is to have European coalition warfare against the potential attacker, likely be Russia. That's exactly what NATO's been doing the whole time.
Yeah,
That's exactly what allies did in the Second World War. It's exactly what allies did in the First World War. So actually, there's a very long history of coalition warfare, and countries like the UK and France have enormous historical experience in doing it. And you don't merge the national armies, you keep the national armies, but you have to create an integrated command structure. You have to agree on who's going to command the forces. You have to agree on common standards. You have to agree on compatible equipment, what's called interoperability, all of those things. And all of those aspects is basically what the day-to-day work of a place like NATO has been all about since its creation. And so basically the question for Europe is, can Europe replicate the NATO model, either take over NATO structures and Europeanize them, or do this through the EU, or do a coalition of the willing? It is possible because there's plenty of precedent. So people know how to do it, but there's a lot of work to be done. And it won't necessarily mean abolishing national armies. I don't think that's necessary. I think the West has an experience of fighting in the form of coalitions, and indeed winning in the form of coalitions. And so that may be the best model we know.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that answer. That was really, really on point. Problem with the percent alone is a rise of the cost of equipment. I guess that'd be the same for everyone, though.
Yeah, less so than one may think, because yes, defense inflation, so the inflation of the prices of defense products as such, can be, of course, and sometimes is higher than normal inflation. But the whole advantage of fixing a percent of GDP for your defense budget is that the budget goes up automatically every year, in line with nominal GDP. In other words, it goes up not just in line with the real growth of GDP, but it also goes in line with the overall rates of inflation, both, right? So it means that a lot of defense inflation is compensated for automatically when you fix your defense budgets as a percent of GDP. It sort of goes up automatically unless you have a massive recession. So it doesn't completely overcome defense inflation, which sometimes is higher, but it deals with a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thank you very much to AJ Simo for gifting ATP Geopolitics memberships. Look, we've got some Canadians in the chat. Spare a thought for Canada at the moment. A lot of pressure from them from the US. And, it's not just rhetoric. If we just laugh stuff off as Trump rhetoric, then I think that's a dangerous position to take. Because there are certain things that appear to be taking place right now that we laughed off previously, and I think the third tenure for Trump is only a matter of time for him attempting to do that. So I think it's at our peril if we dismiss some of the things that Trump sort of jokes about, and the 51st state of America doesn't appear to be a joke anymore. It's now part of the everyday rhetoric of Trump. So, spare a thought for Canada. Give them all the support we can from international friendship. point of view, and obviously Greenland, but of course Ukraine. And we are fundraising this channel. If you go to atpgeo.com/donate, you can go and donate to our latest NAFO campaign. So we're doing that at the moment in cahoots with Rick the Ukrainian and Roman Trochimets. So we're raising money for some trucks there. Please help out with that. Edward, look, I've really enjoyed this. What an absolutely fertile, well, it's fertile territory for these kind of rich discussions. There's so much going on in the world. There's either 5D chess or someone throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. I don't know. It's a mixture of all of the above, but it's a crazy time we live in. And thank you to people like you for helping us make sense of it. Everyone, please go and follow Edward Hunter Christie, particularly on Blue Sky. You'll find him. Just put his name in. Go and follow him. He's absolutely worth following. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Anything you wanted to direct people towards?
I just want to really thank you, Jonathan, and thank your listeners, and thank everyone from their hearts, everyone who's done whatever they could to help our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Whether it's donations, whether you've been there, whatever it was, never ever give up. And remember, the thing that matters most, it's not money, it's not land, it's human lives and human decency. And that's what unites us.
Absolutely. And I think there are definitely some commonalities there between people who don't, I had a live stream last night with Professor Gerdes and Greg Terry and Jonathan Fink, and we all have different political views, but we all come together to recognize the threats to Europe, to global stability, and recognize everything that the Ukrainians are doing, arguably on our behalf. So it's really important that we support Ukraine as much as possible. I know there's unfortunately I'm going to be unable to come to. There's a couple of questions. JR had one about war bonds and the Netherlands. Mineral deal is a strange thing. The process requires 12 to 15 years upfront investment, requires high energy loads and environmental mitigations. There's no business case for most of the veins. I don't know enough about that, Arne Anderson. Thank you very much for that super chat. But yeah, the mineral deal is going to be interesting to see if the US continue to go after that. I don't know. I don't know what the reality is on that front. But yeah, and thank you, Ole Nielsen. I won't be able to have time to answer that. I need to let obviously Edward get on. He's given us an awful amount of time today. I really appreciate that. Thank you, all of you in the super chats. Thank you to the community, but most of all, thank you to Edward Hunter Christie here, who's given us so much to think about, and the understanding of how the world is, or what thinking and ideology might be going on amongst those movers and shakers at the top of the political pyramids here around the world. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody else. Stay on the line, Edward. And remember, atpgeo.com/donate, and we can help out as much as we can. In the meantime, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.